Meal presentation.
Like we always do about this time.
This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Islands. Todo para todos. Nada para nosotros. This land was made for you and me.
Buenos dias, raza. I pray that you're all doing good and coming off a joyous holiday, whether or not you actually celebrated it or just enjoyed some good company and potentially even got a day off. For everybody who didn't get a day off, I'm so sorry. But today we're going to be uplifting somebody who our ancestors may have referred to as a Pohui Potli Isha Nakase, which means an esteemed companion, having good judgment, and a true pioneer of the movement, and our tia as well. So without any further ado, can you please introduce yourself to the folks?
My name is Marcia Rincon-Gallardo, and I am originally from Mexicali, Baja California, Mexico. My parents, Maria, Guadalupe, and my father, Enrique, they're both from Sonora. Actually, my dad was born in LA, in Watts, in 1920. But my mom was born in Magdalena, Sonora, and so they met in Mexicali, and we grew up in La Puente, southeast LA. And I happened to come up to the Bay Area when I went to UC Santa Cruz. So when I talk to people, I like to say that, I'm originally from Mexico, Chicana, Mexicana, Indígena. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to do this podcast with you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I am very appreciative of the fact that you like to ground it in your roots and give a little bit of that brief little snippet of your story from there to here. And so for those out there who may not know, this woman is the founder and director of NOXTIN, and I want to provide you the opportunity really quickly to describe what NOXTIN is to begin with, and also to give a little explanation on how or why did you found NOXTIN.
Absolutely. So first of all, NOXTIN stands for all of us. It's a Nahuatl word that comes from the original language of our indigenous people of Mexico, so our ancestors. And but the name of the organization actually is NOXTIN-Equal Justice for All. And the purpose even of the name, all of us, is because in the field of detention reform, which has been around for about 20 years, when people have said youth of color, so we're going to decrease the number of youth of color sitting in detention, who they've really meant for the past 20 years has not included Latinos or indigenous people. Ourselves, indigenous people, Latinos. However, a lot of people, term themselves different names, Chicano, Mexicano, Hispanic, even some people. But NOXTIN wanted to really uplift and make sure that our indigenous Latino people would be visible and speak about the need of our children, of our families that find themselves within the juvenile justice system. So NOXTIN came about after 20 years of traveling all over this country and seeing that we exist. We are the growing population of youth in this country, and we deserve to be visible so that services, policies, practices can be looked through the lens of how do we serve our population differently. Right? And so NOXTIN then, the actual mission and purpose of NOXTIN is to develop policies and practices that actually work to decrease how many of our young people are entering the juvenile justice system. As I said earlier, the reform field, detention reform field has been around for 20 years. And to this day, even though back in 2002, the first national report regarding Latino youth in the juvenile justice system was written in 2002, at that time we were saying Latinos are getting counted as whites in all the data. And to this day, and we are in 2015, Latinos still get counted as whites in many places around this country. And so even if we were to start with saying, what is the status of Latino youth in the juvenile justice system, we don't have the accurate accurate data to tell us that, and no one's really moving. It took 7 years to write the next national report, and it's been 7 years since. So somebody needed to stand up and say, we are going to focus on Latino youth in the juvenile justice system, and that is what NOXTIN does.
As a mujer, a maestra, and expert within this movimiento, the movement, what are your top 3 priorities? I know there's probably a lot, but those top 3 that just call to you.
All right. Well, I'm happy to actually talk about that because we try to stay very focused in the work that we do. So primarily, I want to say that myself as an individual for years, I would leave my authentic self outside the door so that when I would come to work, there was the professional Marcia, and then when I would leave my work, there was the spiritual, very culturally based mujer that raised my children around many traditions of our indigenous ancestors. And so the number one priority that we bring to the work is that we bring La Cultura Cura, a healing-informed approach to the work that we do, because I believe, not only personally, in the way that I've lived my life and the road that I've chosen for myself and my family, but in the way that I have seen work by, many maestros, many spiritual leaders, is that we bring our true authentic self to the table. And so through NOXTIN, that's number one, is we bring La Cultura Cura, healing, to the work, knowing that by doing the healing work is how we can actually not only heal from the trauma that brings us to the juvenile justice system, but that then through our voice and our participation, our democratic participation, we can actually change the system. Right, through changing policies and practices and getting rid of the system. Number 2 priority is building a cadre, particularly if previously system involved young people and leaders, for the next generation of this work. I tell you and the young people that I work with that I have a shelf life, that I'm probably going to be around doing this work maybe 9 more years, because I've been saying 10 years now for maybe 10 years. And so I think, okay, wow, when I leave, and there's probably like 5 or 10 of us in this field for the past 20 years, I can count them on one hand or 2 hands. How do we possibly build a larger cadre of young people that really care and have an urgency about the work? And so our second priority is to build a strong cadre of young people, and very intentionally previously system involved young people who really have been the most affected, to then learn what it is to do this work through a healing informed approach and equity lens, so that then they can have an impact years to come. And then the last priority, because you asked me for 3, is to bring a community lens to the work of detention reform. For the past 20 years, detention reform always started with the system, that if the system wanted to do the work of reforming the system, then they built their leadership, they knocked on doors of foundations came and gave them money, and they did the work. Well, we believe that out of 3,100 counties all over this country, with only about 300 doing this work in about 38 states, that in fact a lot of Latino communities are not at the table, they've not been engaged, and if we really want to end the cradle to prison pipeline for our people, we need to be aware, involved. Someone needs to be willing to invest in building our capacity, so that if the system doesn't want to do this work, we hold the system accountable. It's our tax dollars that help pay for these systems to exist. And through NOXTIN, we believe very strongly that it should be a community and system partnership to actually reform and transform the system.
Why is the BMOC, or Boys and Men of Color, work important?
Well, John, I think that at least for the past 2 years that I've been working with you all in Milpa, it's very evident. When you look at the numbers all over this country, it's primarily young men and young men of color who sit in these detention facilities behind doors and cells all over this country. Primarily African American, Latino, Indigenous young people, Native American young people, and in some places very targeted Asian populations. And so that when we talk about who is most affected and who should we be focusing to not only make improvements, but have even different kinds of, how can we think outside of the box and consider a world where we don't have this prison industrial complex anymore. And so if we're going to think outside of that box, we must have the voices of boys and men of color at the table to talk about what do they need, what do they see, what could have been different for them, you know. And so at the center of this work is certainly young boys and men of color who, for generations now, I can picture generations of young people who went into the adult system, and our communities miss grandfathers, fathers, husbands, uncles, brothers that sit behind bars to this day. So it's critical that we do the work of boys and men of color in our communities.
There's been this talk of the GWOCs, you know, the girls and women of color. Why is this work also important as well?
I'm so happy you're asking that because, and GWOCs sounds so similar to CWOT, right? Mm-hmm. And CWOT is the Nahuatl word for girls. It's like this. When you have had so many young men and young boys of color in these institutions have primarily responded to boys, and mm-hmm. all of the services, even the structure of how they develop a detention facility to rehabilitation, if they have any, it all looks and feels like directed towards boys. And we know that for young women, it's different. You know, we walk different, we talk different, and we do things differently. And so as the research has shown us about why girls sit in detention is very different from why boys sit in detention. If we're to follow what the research is telling us about who sits in these facilities and that the numbers of girls are growing, I think that it's very important that we also hear the female voice, girls and women, about what works, what doesn't work, what should be improvements to the system, and that we very specifically develop a girls' approach and lens to get rid of the system and make things better for them.
What's your approach towards working with these CWOCs or GWOCs, the girls and women of color?
The counterpart of the girl work, so for example, let me just say that as we've done the development of work with young boys, we ask young men to go through a Joven Noble process, right? Mm-hmm. Well, with the girls, we have a rites of passage process called Shinachli. In the same way that we would ask young men to do a healing process to then be able to sit at a table and do policy work, we also ask young women. And so the work that NOXTIN does with young women is that they first go through Shinachli, and then after that, they go through a fellowship. In the same way that I developed the fellowship for the young Milpa crew, we're in the process of developing a girls' lens fellowship so that they can build their capacity to understand the history of the juvenile justice system, to learn the terminology, the lexicon of the juvenile justice system, learn about detention reform, and then how to read data, so that when they sit at these policy tables, they are actually as equal as they can get to these individuals that work 24/7 in the system. And that from that place of being a leader, that they can then on a day-to-day basis start to actually make changes in the system.
Do you think that tension may exist between the two, the BMOC and the GWOC work? Or does this tension even exist? Mm-hmm. And if there is tension, do you have any suggested solutions in regard to how we may be able to address and or just combat this and create something that's equitable?
I could probably say that I could understand myself being a woman and entering a room where the conversation is just about boys and men of color. So on the one hand, I see myself saying, well, as a mother, as a grandmother, I know that these young men at the end of the day, may come home to a woman. And so for those reasons, I see my mother with my own brother. I see myself with my son, and with all my nephews that I claim. It's important to understand what happens to young men, and to be involved in that policy development. Because if it was just men involved in that, I think that they would lose a big part of what it is for a young man, a joven noble, to come home to a woman, right? Equally so, then, for young women and girls, when we see that the whole movement basically was focused on men and has been focused on young men, and that the numbers are growing for girls, I think that standing up and reiterating that we exist, that we're here, that we're in the system, and not to claim that, hey, we're here, hooray, but more to say we're here and we need help. And so that I think that if there's tension there, which I would venture to say that I could understand if there is tension there, that it has to do with the visibility, right? So let's say in the juvenile justice system, there's anywhere from 70 to 80% of young men in the system, juvenile justice system. And then there's 20 to 30%. 30% would be pretty high. Normally it's around 20, 25% of young girls in the system, whether it's sitting in detention or whether it's on probation. There's about 20 to 25% women. So I get it that we would want to spend a lot of our efforts looking at men and young boys of color. But at the same time, money must be put aside to focus just on girls, and that the programming and the policies and practices must be through that lens of girls. And that it is young women and women developing those policies and reviewing those policies to make sure that they are effective and responsive to girls. Yeah.
What makes the NOXTIN and MILPA partnership unique?
Excellent question that I'm happy to respond to. I want to start by saying that in, the 100+ years of the development of the juvenile justice system, very few people around this country ever evaluated, ever questioned decision-making, the policies, the practices of this criminal justice system. And as a people, we have every right to know it, understand it, and in the same way that, our public school institutions, that as parents we have a right to know, and we must be involved in the education of our children. We must move away from the shame of thinking that because our young person is in that juvenile justice system, that we should close our eyes and walk away and let them do whatever they're doing to our young person, that in fact we have a right. We must be involved as a community to find out, and in particular find out why it's failing our community, right? You know very well, I showed you a lot of the statistics, and I showed you it's hard to talk about it, but I'm going to try to describe it here on this podcast, is that we are the country in the world that incarcerates the most people. And when you look at the columns of all the other countries, they're very low. They're maybe an inch high. But when you get to China, you get to Russia, and then you get to the United States, it's like, a ruler, 12 inches high. And all that to say that we are a country that has had a love affair with incarceration. If we were a corporation, people would be looking left and right, be all inside of why is it that we continue to throw money at a system that is failing. Because year after year after year of sending our young people who have committed low-level offenses continue to be in the system, brought into the system, and brought back over and over without questioning what is it about the system. The system likes to question what is it about these kids, these dysfunctional families, why they can't get out of probation. It never occurred to us to ask the question, what is it about the system that intentionally, in some places, is incarcerating more and more of our kids and driving them deeper and deeper into the system? And I say all that as contextual to then why the NOXTIN-MILPA partnership is so unique. Well, the reason is you have NOXTIN, which is very focused on the transformation of the system. And then you have MILPA, who are, in some cases, previously system-involved young people who have a desire to change and transform not only this system, but other systems. And the beauty of it is that we're partnering to bridge sort of multi-generationally and to groom, to build capacity of our leadership so that for generations to come, we can continue to bridge our authentic selves, bringing our healing informed La Cultura Cura, who we are, where we come from, bringing that to front and center to help us every day, beat that vicarious trauma, just to even have to deal with a system that has failed so many. We go home thinking about things. For those of us who were in the system, we bring those wounds with us. And so by bridging our authentic selves, bringing the healing informed, we can then do the work. We come together in Círculo, we have palabra with each other, we put out what our gifts and baggages, and so that we can do the healing on a day-to-day basis that allows us to present ourselves fully when we come to do the work. If we can't present ourselves fully, we come in danger of impacting the work and setting it back. And so the beauty of all of those pieces that are just as important, including the equity work, governing by racial equity, and that whole notion that equality is not enough, that in fact we need equity. And so when, we have people in this country that say, why do we even have to rehabilitate you? If you committed a crime, let's throw you in and throw away the key. And no, we're not going to do that. It has to do with equality, right? And so anyway, for those reasons, I think that the partnership between NOXTIN and MILPA for years to come, we can not only build the cadre, but we can have that very concentrated focus to want to not only improve, but transform to someday even saying we don't even have detention facilities in this country, right? That we can even say those words, and that some people could visualize a community that takes care of our young people that break a rule or get in trouble with the law. I've been very fortunate to work with MILPA. I believe that this partnership is solid and will be around for years to come. I think the last thing that I want to say is that there's a whole lineage of people that rarely get mentioned, both women and men in our history, that are our ancestors that have moved on and passed into the spirit world, that came before me, came before you and some of our listeners, that made it possible for us to be here today. And I just want to make note of that, that I can think of, all the research that we did when we developed youth and the U.S. justice system from a Latino lens, and just the numerous articles and books and just so much information that goes all the way back, not to just the 1500s and forward, but even beyond that, to our ancestors, our original ancestors, that made it possible for us to even reach back and say, there was a different way in which we treated each other, right? That there were values and principles and teachings that were critical to the way in which we restored each other, the way that we held each other accountable, the way that we kept our, public safety alive. And so I just want to uplift that is all there, and that we shouldn't be afraid to reach into our own genetic memory, right? To remember that there was very human, that being human with each other, the humanity that we have with each other around representing what we can do, so that we don't have to rely on these big buildings, four-walled buildings, as a way to respond to our young people who actually have trauma. And so, again, just thank you for this opportunity to be here to speak to you, and that, NOXTIN and MILPA, we have a lot of information that we would love to share, given the opportunity. So thank you.
Well, that's gonna do it for us today, gente. Thank you so much for being patient with us. And as always, your Milpas en Cali signing off with our culture, consciousness, and movement building.
I came from nothing, but not nothing like nothing. Nothing like nobody thought I was something. Nothing like called every name in the book. But for every second guess, I never gave a second look.